Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior and experienced professional from Ohio, USA, Mr. Mike Taylor. Mike, welcome to the show.
Good morning.
Mike is the learning, design, and technology innovator, and he's doing things which are making work smarter and learning cooler. He's also a learning consultant at Nationwide. So, Mike, before we get into any discussions on learning and technology and design, tell me about your own journey in brief.
So I've been sort of energized by learning as far back as I can remember. So I was actually one of those kids who didn't mind going to school and even to the point of I bugged my parents so much that they arranged to let me go to school a whole year early.
Okay.
And so that kind of sort of illustrates, I think, how much, how much I enjoy learning and the process of learning and just,
Mm,
everything
mm,
around it. And so, that led me, long story short, I always thought I would do something related to learning. This whole world of instructional design and learning design, I didn't even know existed. And so, feel really fortunate to work in a field that this offers so many opportunities and you have an opportunity to help people. And, I've been very fortunate to have a really wide range of experiences in that field, sort of working from
yeah.
everything from a, one person training department, which a lot of people do, working with, big multinational corporations. I spent some time, about 5 years working in L&D for a digital marketing agency, which was super informative. And then kind of leading up to today, I have a book that I've written with my co-author, Bianca Bauman,
Mhm,
that's coming out in May.
mhm.
And it's all about how L&D can adopt sort of a marketing mindset to get better outcomes in their L&D practice.
Wow. And, when I was reading about you preparing for my conversation, um, what struck me was a term that you used, that you're on a mission of eliminating boring, ineffective training. What inspired you to take up this mission, and how do you define boring training?
Yeah, and I think probably everybody listening, when we talk about boring training, there's probably at least one thing that pops immediately into people's heads. And it's kind of like I think of it as sort of like the Hippocratic Oath for learning is do unto others. So don't put out any training you yourself wouldn't want to take.
Right.
There's one in particular, one example that stands out to me, and this has been, gosh, 10 or 15 years ago. And I remember it was about 90 minutes long,
Mm,
and they spent whew, probably 10, 15, 20 slides talking about the mission and this and like all of this other irrelevant stuff. And it's just so boring. It just
mm,
makes you want to sort of poke your eyeballs out.
mm.
And in fact, I had the opportunity to remake that course,
Okay.
and it went from 90 minutes to 11
Mm,
with the same amount of content. And I call that my $1 million course because it was a required training for 30,000 people.
mm,
And we gave them 90 or 80 minutes
mm,
back to their workday.
mm.
And, so it's not about eliminating boring training unless you can replace it with something that's valuable and ideally people actually want to engage with.
Mm. Great response. And you also use a phrase called working smarter. How do you define working smarter in the context of learning and development?
Yeah, so depending on who you ask, they might say that I'm either lazy or efficient. I like to think it's efficient. Um, but I think in the context of L&D, everything starts with understanding your learners and your audience. So understanding what's relevant to them, um, creating stuff that's valuable and relevant is, and we probably will reflect on that a couple times throughout the rest of this conversation. But beyond that, being working smarter could take sort of the form of being resourceful with content. So a lot of times we get stuck in the wheel of just generating content when we've got a lot of stuff that we could already repurpose in a different way,
Right.
reformat, mix internal expertise with external things. Using technology smart is another big thing that I'm a big fan of. So things like Zapier and automation to be able to connect systems together,
Mm.
avoid that whole download a spreadsheet here, manipulate it, upload it someplace else. And that type of thing lets us be more efficient and spend more time on the valuable things and less
Mhm.
time on sort of monotonous, brain dead type stuff.
Very interesting. And what would you say are some of the core principles of effective instructional design?
Yeah, so I would start with the learner-centric
Yeah.
approach that I just mentioned.
Yeah.
Understanding, what are their challenges, what are they struggling with, what do they need, and really keeping it relevant to them. And that's something that if you can do that, then you're not going to have boring training because it's valuable to the people that you're talking to.
Mhm.
Um, Getting beyond sort of traditional, old school lecture formats. Using diverse instructional design approaches, right? So if we can be interactive, give them scenarios, make them apply what they're learning.
Mhm.
Another big one I think is huge is just sort of a general understanding of how our brains process information.
Mhm.
And one of the big things in that area for me is just understanding how much of our subconscious and emotional mindset influences our behavior. And I think that's something that's not really common yet. And um, hopefully with the book and other things that we can sort of help, spread that a little more broadly.
Mhm. Very interesting. And what, in your view, are some of the biggest mistakes organizations make when creating learning experiences?
Yes. So I think, one of the biggest ones is not understanding that sort of how we process information and what influences behavior.
Mhm.
So I think a lot of times we intuitively think, oh, we're going to give people this whole big dump of facts and figures and they'll be logical and then they'll do it. And that's not
Mhm.
really how we work.
Right.
So we get stuck into this big content dump and we just dump content on people and facts and figures and it's really um, not a great approach. And so rethinking that again with our sort of learners at the center of all that, I think
Mhm.
is probably the biggest thing that I've seen.
Fair enough. And my next question is that, and everyone's now all over the world are talking about how important it is to be a good storyteller. How important is storytelling in engaging learners? And how do you incorporate it into your sessions?
Yeah, it's really big. I'm glad you asked this question because I think stories are a really effective tool to help make our learning stickier. It can sort of transform, dry lessons into something that's more captivating and
Right.
will grab our attention and also help us remember.
Mhm.
There's a lot of research and studies behind that fact that, you know, our brains are wired for stories.
Mhm.
So it helps us do things like, see concepts in new ways. It helps us connect emotionally, which we were just talking about a second ago. Simplify complex ideas, make it more relatable. So, helping people see things from their own perspective,
Mhm.
connecting with emotions, and then there's a lot of ways you can incorporate.
Mhm.
So you can use case studies, you can do role plays, uh, personal anecdotes. The other thing too that I think is another big opportunity for
Mhm.
people that do our kind of work is visual storytelling.
Mhm.
So, the old phrase, a picture's worth 1,000 words
Yeah.
is really pretty true.
Hmm. Interesting. What, in your view, is the role of automation? And, with artificial intelligence, generative AI, and so many other things coming into our lives, what, in your view, is the role of automation to develop L&D programs and help L&D professionals to work smarter?
Yeah, so this is something I'm pretty excited about also. And, some people sort of are afraid it's going to replace us.
Mhm.
And I don't see it that way. I think it's actually a great opportunity for us to offload some of the manual work to AI. So some things that are regimented and let us actually focus on things that are more valuable. So strategic thinking, um, things that are more important and more impactful. So we can save tons of time. I mentioned automation stuff a little earlier. So take off administrative things like scheduling and reminders and all of that stuff, and then use AI tools, automation tools to create more engaging and dynamic experiences. If anybody is curious, Zapier on their website, they have a fantastic case study
Mhm.
about how their L&D team saved over 1,000 hours a year in automating their processes, which is really super insightful.
I must go and read it myself because Zapier is quite an amazing company.
Yeah.
But moving on, Mike, how do you determine whether a new tool or technique is genuinely beneficial or is it just a shiny object?
Yes, I think most of us and including myself have the shiny object syndrome, and we see something new and flashy and we get very excited about it and we rush to go try it out.
Mm.
And I am guilty of that myself and always have to remind myself like, okay, there's probably some small number of questions that we have to apply before we go all in on a tool or a technology. And one is, A, does it work? Is it effective? Um, can it be easily implemented? So
Mm.
usability is another important thing. It doesn't take much friction for people on the other end to just give up and walk away. Cost is always important factor. So are we getting a return on what we're investing in a tool? And then the last one is, can it integrate with what we're already doing? So program wise, technology stack wise, does it connect, or is it, yet another place that we're going to have to
Mm.
manage and administrate?
Mm. Well said. Great response. And what, in your view, is the role of empathy for the learner to create effective training programs?
This to me is a huge one. And it really gets back to understanding who you're designing for.
Mm.
So, go beyond just what's the job titles. What do they do? What do they care about? What are their problems? What are their challenges? And it helps you, I think, respect people's time.
Mhm.
Back to that 90-minute course that we made 11 minutes, that's the
Yeah.
perfect example.
Mm.
And it helps us create training and learning experiences that feel
Mm.
relevant. And so we're getting beyond that content dump of stuff that we referenced earlier
Mm.
to hopefully, ideally help us create things that people actually want and need.
Mm.
I actually did a big compliance project once, probably 6 or 7 years ago. It was back when Game of Thrones was really popular,
Mhm.
and we had a particular character in some of the videos, and he was so good that I've actually gotten emails of people asking me, "Hey, what else is he in? I don't care what the topic is. It's so good. I just want to see
Yeah.
more of that guy."
Mm.
So it is possible.
Okay. And what, in your view, or how do you design training that would cater to a diverse set of learning preferences and styles? And you live in a country which is probably one of the most culturally diverse countries in the world.
Yeah, yeah. So I think one before I answer that, I just want to make a distinction here about, the instructional design methods versus things like learning styles, which that could be a whole can of worms that we won't open. But really, what research and science behind this is, it's the instructional design method which has the biggest impact on whether your learning is effective or not. So things like we were talking about earlier, how do our brains actually process information,
Yeah.
cognitive load theory principles and spaced repetition. So that's much more important than the modality that we're using. So certain types of content lend themselves to certain types of methods. So for example, if I'm learning how to dance, I need to do some physical practice. I can't just read a book or, take in information.
Yeah.
And then the other thing along with that is kind of this idea of universal design principles. So How are we organizing it? Is it clear structure? Are we breaking those down into manageable chunks? Again, back to cognitive overload. Are people getting appropriate feedback opportunities? Things like that. So it's really the instructional design approach, which is critical to hit that mark.
Hmm. Interesting. One of the questions I wanted to ask you also was that you talk about shortcuts. How do you balance finding shortcuts with maintaining quality in training design? And can you share an example of a shortcut that you discovered that significantly improved your own workflow?
Yeah. So I did a project about 6 or 7 years ago,
Mhm.
and we it was when I was at the digital market agency. So this was before I was at Nationwide, but it was a sales training project for Nationwide, and we did this really pretty robust blended learning program, and it involved 42 live in-person workshops in 40 different cities all across the country over the span of about 12 months.
Mm,
And so there was data from registration, there was data that went from the registration into online courses, into webinar scheduling, thousands and thousands of people,
mm,
all this data going every which way.
mm,
And so had I had to manage that manually, A, it would have been a headache. B, I probably would have messed some things up along the way.
mm,
And so what I was able to do is I used Zapier to connect the web form for the registration. I could connect that directly to our webinar registration, directly to, we had an email drip campaign
mm,
tied to the workshop date that sent things, right people, right place, right time.
mm,
And then we also sent data from that form to a Google Sheet that we used as a performance tracking. So it was around digital selling on LinkedIn, and there was data that was sort of before, during, and after that we could measure the effectiveness of what we were doing.
right.
And so I spent a little bit of time up front to create those connections. And then while we were in the heat of running that program, I never had to get into that whole download, upload process stuff. It just, I kind of call it plumbing for the internet, and you're connecting all your tech stack together.
Fantastic. Thank you. I have time for two or three more questions. Can you give us a story or share an anecdote where you transformed a particularly lackluster training program into something engaging and impactful?
Yeah, this is another great question. So one of my favorites in that regard worked with a healthcare company
Mhm.
for their onboarding program. So before, like a lot of places, an onboarding was a multi-day. You're just overwhelmed with PowerPoints and documents, and there may be a fair amount of irrelevant things in there for people who are in different roles and different locations.
Mm,
I think everybody can probably relate to that. And so what we did is we switched it from that information dump to something that was a more personalized journey.
mhm,
So based on their role, based on their city, so geographic location, we built out a tree sort of using email marketing platform.
mhm,
So it created a drip campaign where tied to certain dates, unique to their role, unique to their location.
mhm,
So if they were a doctor in Lexington versus an administrative staff in
mhm,
Louisville, they got targeted information,
mhm,
and only little by little, so digestible chunks, so,
mhm,
so delivered uh, when they needed it, not something that they put on the shelf and never look at again. And that was a really, really big success that people, both delivering it and receiving it, really loved a lot.
mhm. Well said. Two more questions for you. My next question is, what's a new trend in instructional design that you think will have a lasting impact in the industry?
So I think there's two. The first one, obviously, we mentioned earlier, AI. Um, I'm gonna set that aside because I think AI really is a tool, and how you apply it is the critical piece of that.
Right.
And so you can use that with a lot of ways and a lot of trends and approaches. But the really big one is what Bianca and I wrote our book about, and it's this idea of what can L&D adopt from the marketing field.
Mm,
So if we think about it, L&D and marketers, we really share common goals. We're both trying to get people's attention,
mm,
and we're both trying to get them to do something, change their behavior in some way.
mm,
And we would propose that marketers a lot of times are better at it than we are. So, what can we look to them to steal? So things that we've talked about, storytelling, visual appeal, uh, campaigns that use multiple channels and multiple touch points, using data to make decisions,
mm.
and then using some of their technology. There's some really great marketing technologies that apply directly to L&D, and that's super helpful.
Well said. And you already answered my last question. I was going to ask you about your book, but you already told me. But tell me, it's coming out in May 25, and tell me a little bit more about your book.
Yeah, so we have been talking about this topic probably now for 7 or 8 years. We've done workshops and talked at conferences and all that sort of stuff, and it still seems to be resonating with people. I think there's some intuitive connection between those two fields. And what we did in the book was we both have experience in working in marketing agencies doing L&D work. So what we've done is we've tried to take our experiences, combine those, and put them in a way that it's in plain English. It's not a bunch of technical terms. We've got examples and case studies in there. And so we try to make it practical so that you could pick out pieces from the book and take it and apply it right away without needing, an expert to come in and help you with that stuff. So that's our goal, and
Yeah,
hopefully we've hit the mark on that.
absolutely. And on that note, Mike, I just want to say what an amazing 25-minute 101 on lesson learning and development your conversation has been with me. We covered some very, very interesting topics, including starting with boring training, and I loved your definition, to defining working smarter. We spoke about biggest mistakes organizations make. We spoke about how important storytelling is. What is the role of automation? You also gave me some very interesting insights into empathy and diversity of, for learning preferences. And of course, I loved the two or three interesting anecdotes or stories that you gave to me. Thank you also for speaking to me about your book, and all the very best for the launch of your book. Once it is launched, hopefully we'll do another conversation around your book. Thank you again for
Yeah,
speaking.
absolutely, absolutely. I would love that. Thanks for inviting me. It
Thank you.
was a great conversation, and I could talk about this for days. So this has been a lot of fun.
Yes, thank you again. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.